So the story you just heard Joanne read happens right after a very exciting story. Elijah has taken on the prophets of Baal and Asherah, 850 of them, and he challenges them to a scene made for reality TV, a prophet-off, if you will. Israeli Idol would be a good name for it in more ways than one. Because Israel has been following false gods. After Solomon's rule, which we heard about last week with the temple, the United Kingdom of Israel will collapse, in part because of the bills from building the temple, but the northern tribes will rebel against the Davidic line and they become Israel in the divided kingdom. And the tribes of Judah and Benjamin in the south become the nation of Judah. Ahab is the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, and his wife Jezebel is a foreigner. The marriage was a political alliance to bring peace on the Phoenician border, and she brings with her some false gods. They must be very appealing, however, because there are a lot of prophets and a lot of people bowing down to the false gods. God's prophet, Elijah, shows up and is a thorn in Ahab and Jezebel's side. They do not like him at all. He is trying to call the people back to the Lord while they're trying to keep their political alliance together by having people worship all the gods they want to worship. And so Ahab and Jezebel want to kill Elijah. They've already killed over 100 prophets of the Lord. So now to our show, Israeli Idol. I'll let you read chapter 18 in your free time, but here are some highlights. He challenges the prophets of the false gods to a showdown, his God against their gods. He even stacks the deck in their favor. And then he mocks them, and then he crushes them, like Gary Payton 2 on defense. Then he kills them all. Elijah flees while Ahab goes back and tells Jezebel about what happened to all of her prophets, which is where our text today had picked up. Elijah knows all about the power of God, friends. He has seen it in full and public display, and yet, "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors," he cries out. I can't decide if Elijah's humanity here is comforting or depressing. I'd like to think that if only I could see God's awesome acts of power as he has just done on Mount Carmel, that I would have faith enough to spare. That's all I really need, I think. Just one big miracle like the showdown with the false prophets, and I'll be set. But just a few verses after his moment of triumph, when he wins Israeli Idol, and Elijah is asking to die because he feels so alone. He may not be afraid of the false prophets, but he's certainly afraid of Jezebel. And even though he has just seen God put on a resounding display, it does not occur to Elijah in that moment that the God who just delivered him in the past is going to deliver him now. We, of course, are like that too. Miracles happen all around us, even in our own lives. But then something happens. Jezebel and Ahab come making their threats, and we go blank. A crisis of confidence that erases what we know to be true and replaces it with panic. I don't know why it happened to Elijah. I don't know why it happens to us. You'd think the signs and the wonders he had seen would have been enough to sustain him. You'd think they'd be enough to sustain us. But they don't. Perhaps this text is a reminder to us that signs and wonders like the show Elijah puts on before the false prophets are not what sustain our faith. Perhaps this text is a reminder to us that the voices of this world, the threats of Jezebel, they're more than mere words. They are often scary enough to cause us to forget what we know to be true. They are often loud enough to drown out the sound of our faith. This story catches Elijah when he feels completely alone, totally isolated, so cut off from the other people and maybe even from God that he feels he alone is left. He had also just killed 850 prophets of Baal and Asherah. It's possible to imagine that that could make you feel alone and cut off, no matter how much you felt you had done the right thing. Taking human lives is not a trivial matter. Jezebel had also just killed hundreds of God's prophets, Elijah's colleagues, some of them probably his friends from seminary and presbytery meetings. There's a lot of death in the background of this text. And when we don't allow our grief and loss to be in the front of our story where it needs to be, we feel isolated and cut off from the people who could help us. Friends, there's a lot of grief and loss in our world too. We have now passed 750,000 people dead from COVID in this country alone, plus the rest of the people who we know who we've lost to cancer and diseases and other causes. When we don't allow our grief and loss to be in the front of our story, we feel isolated and cut off from the people who could help us. I alone am left. This week, I received some sad news a few minutes before I was about to lead a session meeting, and I thought, in typical Marci fashion, I'll be fine. I'll just power through. I don't have time to be sad right now. I'll feel sad later. Those who were on that Zoom call can tell you that is not at all how it worked. I started to cry, and then I told people what had happened and why I was sad. And they were able to care for me as I led a very mediocre meeting. But at the end of the meeting, as I was closing us in prayer and I could barely find the words to pray, it occurred to me while I was praying that there were 20 other people on that call who could and would have prayed if I had just asked them. And maybe the session meeting could have ended with a coherent prayer. I alone am left. I am actually feeling personally attacked by this scripture passage. I like it a whole lot better when it convicts you than when it convicts me. I alone am left. In Bible study this week, while looking at this passage, my friend and I noticed that when Elijah tells God he is feeling alone, did you notice what God does? He sends him out to be alone for 40 more days. Attacked, I tell you, attacked. I am a person who prefers to be in the mix and with people far more than I ever want to be left alone with my thoughts. Even when I have to do solitary work, such as writing sermons, I am much better at it when I'm in the middle of a loud coffee shop than I am in the sheer silence of my empty house, where the laundry calls. Pandemic shutdown was hard on the extroverts, friends. It's changing a little for me as I get older. I'm more inclined to decide a day spent by myself is not some sort of divine punishment, but maybe even a reward. But even so, the idea of being sent alone into 40 more days of isolation when I already feel alone, I do not like that plan. And I think many people are afraid of the silence of their own thoughts, because maybe we're afraid of what we'll hear in the silence. Will the inner critic be so loud we can't drown them out? Will our fears be revealed to be true? Will our worries take over? I wonder what God needed Elijah to come to understand while he was feeling alone. What was it that Elijah needed 40 days and 40 nights by himself in the wilderness to hear? It gets me twitchy all this time in the wilderness, left alone with my thoughts. And in truth, even when I am by myself, I'm rarely alone. I can text my friends, or I can be distracted by the earthquakes of COVID disruption, or the winds of whatever is coming out of Washington, or the fires of personal conflict and stress. But God draws Elijah away from the tumult and the noise of Jezebel and Ahab and toward the mountain of God. And after a 40 days journey, he reaches the mountain where Moses had seen God pass by, and then the earth, wind, and fire appear. Elijah is told to stand on the mountain as God passes by, and God's not in the noise, the destruction, the chaos, the tumult, the flames. God's in the silence that follows. I don't think that means God's absent from the earthquake, winds, and fire that disrupt and trouble our lives. We believe there is nothing in life or in death that can separate us from God. But I wonder if it suggests that if we really want to find God, we can't be distracted by the actions of politicians and Ahabs and Jezebels. We can't be distracted by the destruction of human violence and reach the conclusion that all of the destruction they cause is what God intends, because it's not. Elijah, despite his crisis of confidence, is able to recognize God when God appears. And it seems likely that silence would not be the place Elijah would have looked for God. Because in the biblical account, when God appears, God is usually in a burning bush or a pillar of fire or a pillar of dust. The word for God, spirit, is the same as our word for wind. And perhaps we expect God to be flashy, to put on a show, to wow us with laser light shows and displays of grandeur like God had just done in the prophet off. We want God to be earthquake, wind, and fire. But for Elijah, in his weakest moment, God is the absence of noise, asking, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" I love this question. It can mean so many things. What are you doing as my prophet, Elijah? Why are you here 40 days into the wilderness and not somewhere else? Why are you feeling so sorry for yourself? Why are you alone and so far from others who could help you? Elijah gives the same answer both times God asked the question. I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant and thrown down your altars and killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. I'm not convinced Elijah actually answers God's question. But God seems to hear the answer hidden in Elijah's reply. I'm isolated. I'm alone. I don't remember the things that are important. So God offers Elijah grace and gives him the answers he needs. And given concrete tasks, he's told to appoint Jehu king, and Jehu will clean up the political mess. He's told to appoint Elisha as his successor. Elijah is not alone on either the political or the spiritual front. Through sheer silence, God calls him back to his purpose. And God gives Elijah answers to the question God was asking him, and then sends him back to work, fed, nourished, with a nap, equipped for the journey. It occurred to me this week that even though the answers are the same both times, I wonder if the subtext in the way he delivers it is different. I think if I were directing Elijah in a play, I would have him read the first answer in his most whiny and pathetic voice. I alone am left. Woe is me. But the second time, after 40 days and nights of being alone, I would have him answer it with the weight of it. I, alone, am left. Elijah had been doing it all himself, and he didn't take a committee with him to battle the false prophets, and he had not been taking care of himself, and he was distracted by the noise of earthquakes, wind, and fire, and he forgot who he was, and he forgot whose he was. At first, he was whining because he was alone and scared and jangly in need of a nap. The second time he answers God, he's aware that he had isolated himself in all the wrong ways, aware the sounds and distractions of the world had gotten in his way. Thinking about this text has called to mind for me a quote by Corrie ten Boom, who was a Dutch Christian and a Holocaust survivor. She said, "Never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God." I think that was what God was trying to get Elijah to see during this crisis of confidence. As it was for Elijah, the future that we also cannot imagine can also be a scary place because we don't know what it holds. There are voices all around us telling us to be afraid of just about everything. But friends, the Ahabs and the Jezebels of this world are just speculating. The sounds of chaos and tumult and fear are nothing compared to the sound of sheer silence where God's voice is. How is it with your soul these days? As I've already confessed, I am a little more like Elijah at the beginning of the story than I wish I were. I tend to go it alone, power through until I collapse in a pathetic heap, desperate for a cookie and a hug. But one thing that I do that helps me is I sit in the morning when I wake up for 20 minutes of contemplative centering prayer. And sometimes that 20 minutes feels like it's 4 hours long. And sometimes I struggle to let my thoughts go through my mind without having to latch on to every single one of them that goes by. But I find that when I give myself that time each morning, when I leave my to-do list and the earth, wind, and fire behind of my inbox, in my email, the distractions of my phone, then I'm more likely to find the absence of noise where God's presence is. We're told that Elijah heard the silence, which seems an odd way to describe it, doesn't it? He heard an absence of sound. It makes me think of going back home after my father died and realizing, because of his absence, how big of a presence his life had been for me, for my family. It was like seeing a film negative, for those of you who are old enough to remember when film was how you got pictures. Seeing him more clearly when he wasn't there, the empty space where he had been. Centering prayer is what helps me hear the silence where God might speak. It slows my life and my brain down enough to filter out the noise and chaos. It's not that God speaks to me in words during that time, in a voice I can hear. But when I take the time to do it, I hear God's voice throughout the rest of my day, in my interactions with people, by noticing God's beauty in our created world, all because it slows me down to be able to be present enough to notice those things. And we're going to try it right now, not for 20 minutes, but for a few minutes. So I invite you to uncross and unclench whatever it is you have crossed and clenched at the moment. Let go of whatever it is you're holding on to and get as comfortable as you can be in a 150-year-old church pew. Close your eyes and in the silence, observe your own thoughts without latching onto them. I like to picture myself standing on a bridge, and my thoughts are the river rushing below. I can't stop myself from having the thoughts that I have, but when I can catch onto one of those shiny thoughts as they go past, I try to release it in a stream. So don't judge yourself or your thoughts or the noises you may hear around you. Just observe and notice your breath and breathe in God's love and breathe out God's love for the world. I promise I won't leave you in silence forever. We'll start now. Amen. What did you notice in the silence? That's your assignment this week. I noticed how much support and love I can feel in a room full of silent people. Friends, we are walking into an unknown future with a known God, and the God who provided for us in the past is laying out plans that will guide us through the future. So may we learn to be comfortable listening for God, whether in the chaos and tumult or in the sheer silence. Never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. Amen.